He took a shot of whiskey to gather his courage and approached her from across the bar. He'd seen her here before, her curly black hair and flannel shirt making her stand out a bit in this sea of name-brand dresses and trendy cocktails. She wasn't a cosmopolitan kind of girl. He'd watched her nurse the same tumbler of whiskey all night as she sat near the wall and watched the crowd. He'd learned to covet her smiles and laughs, that bright flash of sparkling teeth as some stage play of the human condition went on before her. Not that she had anyone to share her smiles and laughs with. Every time he'd seen her, she'd always been alone, and her joy seemed only to come from the people who heaved and thronged around her. She was an island in their ocean, and he was going to discover why tonight. As he made his way towards her, he couldn't help but wonder why no one else ever approached her. She always sat in the same dim corner of the Colonnade Bar, a run-of-the-mill bar in Seattle, Washington, with her back to the wall and her eyes trained on the byplay between the patrons. The Colonnade was not as crowded as the dance clubs or the upscale wine bars that dotted the city like ticks, but it did tend to attract a certain kind of people. Young college kids in their early 20s, bohemians looking to brusque on the small stage or talk to potential clients over craft beer, fishermen back from a long day on the decks, office drones, trust fund kids looking to rub elbows with the common man, and any other misfit who was just looking for a drink and some conversation were typical fare in a place like this. It was a friendly place, a somewhat chaotic haven, and those who frequented it often felt like they became family. But in the 2 years that Russell had seen her come in, only the bartender seemed to acknowledge her presence at all. Noelle had looked over at the woman when Russell asked about her and shook her head. "No, I don't think I know her name." This had been a few weeks ago, back when he was still gathering his courage to talk to her. Noelle had seemed the best one to talk to for information. Noelle was the owner of the bar and had been bartending here for quite some time. She seemed to know just about everyone here, and Russell figured that she would be the best source of information. Russell pressed her for more information about the strange woman, as she handed a frothing glass to a bearded hipster who'd pushed up to the bar to order. "Well, how long has she been coming here? Has anyone talked to her?" Noelle looked up from the shot she was pouring. As she looked at the woman, Russell saw the head of black curls look back towards the bar, and affix Noelle with a decidedly mistrustful look. "She doesn't talk to anyone. No one talks to her. I would suggest that you leave her be. For your own safety," Noelle said dismissively. For his own safety? The statement had seemed oddly chosen to Russell. Maybe Noelle knew more about her than she was letting on. Perhaps the woman was dangerous. That's why no one approached her. Maybe she had been coming here longer than even Russell believed. Maybe it would be safer not to approach her. As he parted the bar patrons, however, he had already made up his mind that he would talk to her. From the moment he had first noticed her, he had felt drawn to her for some reason. He almost felt like it was his fate to speak with her. Who was he to deny fate? The whiskey in his hand sloshed thickly as he walked, and he nimbly dodged some Chad in a visor as he stood up suddenly. His caw of indignation drew the dark-haired girl's gaze, and she seemed to notice Russell for the first time as he approached her table. She looked away, her casual posture now looking forced, but he couldn't help but notice the furtive looks she was casting his way, like a rabbit sitting a predator, like a hungry dog that doesn't want to bite. "Excuse me," Russell said, standing over her as she perched on a spindly chair. She ignored him, purposefully ignored him, and he could sense an unwillingness to acknowledge him that was almost spiteful. Her glances dared him to try her, confronted him with continuing down this path, and he worried that maybe she was unstable. Maybe Noelle had been trying to save him some trouble, trying to save the poor girl some face, and Russell had gone and made himself an unwilling star in the next public spectacle. He dipped his head a little and excused himself, turning slightly to go and hoping to be instantly swallowed by the crowd. When her hand came out and caught him by the arm, she had a strength that surprised him. He would not have expected such a grip from a 5'2" frame. "You've made the trip. You might as well stay." Her voice held a strange aura of languages. It sounded Irish, Slavic, Russian, Western European, the tones of the old country. Her voice had been places, seen things, lived through the Depression, survived the Spanish flu, and knew what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land. He had heard their first conversation 1,000 times in his head, but this was as far from the voice he had imagined as salt was from sugar. As he took his seat, the plastic cushion beneath him became a bear trap. "I'm sorry," Russell began. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I've been watching you from across the bar for a long time, and, well, I felt drawn to me," she said in that old worn voice. He nodded, entranced by her as he sat within arm's reach of her enigma. She smiled. "Would you believe that you're the first person to tell me that in a very long time?" He nodded again. "I don't understand how anyone can be in the same bar with you and not feel the same way. I felt the same way once, a long, long time ago." She looked down at her empty whiskey glass and seemed saddened by it. "When I sat down across from him at this very table." Russell leaned in a little, enchanted by her words as she spun her web for him. "When you sat down across from who?" he asked, almost dreamily. He would puzzle over how he'd felt that night for many nights to come, and all his brain could find to compare it with was the nature video they had sometimes watched in school. You see the fly walk into the mouth of the Venus flytrap, watch the jaws close around it, and ask how it could be so stupid as to walk straight into the jaws of death. The fly is a capable survivor, a quick little nuisance that evades the human hand with ease, but it still walks into its grave with no hesitation, as though it just can't help itself. When he remembered that night with her, he knew how that fly must feel when it narrowly escapes the mouth of the trap, when it glances back to find itself longing to return. "Would you believe that he told me someone would come to talk to me? That he told me to expect you? Isn't that funny?" "So funny," Russell said, dreamily, unable to stop himself. The whole world shimmered at the edges while he was around her. Russell never wanted this moment to stop. He was captivated, utterly bewitched, and he felt that he would gladly go on basking in her glory all night. On the other hand, she looked as though she were getting a little tired of the whole affair, and just as quickly as he had risen, Russell began to fall. What if she left? What if she just didn't want to talk to him? He didn't think he could stand it if she wasn't... He didn't even notice that she had taken his drink until it was already in her hand. She lifted it to her perfect Cupid's bow lips and took a sip. The last beads of the whiskey clung to them as she pursed them and blew atop the surface of the amber liquid. In that breath, a corona of light was born. Dazzling, it stunned him temporarily as he watched the universe dance in that brilliance. She brought the glass away from her lips and held it out to him, delicate hands wrapping the glass perfectly. He was powerless to stop himself from reaching out to take it. "Drink this. It might bring things back into focus." Russell drained the glass in a single pull, and things immediately began to change. The woman across from him didn't become less attractive. She didn't really change at all, but he became more aware of his surroundings and less aware of her. The busker on stage warbled back into consciousness. The sounds of the crowd rose from an insectile ree to something rumbling. He felt the edges around his vision harden as he looked at her. She was still cute, but she was now possessed of a look that led him to question her gender. Her flannel shirt and tight jeans now looked mannish, and her bouncy curls and facial features now made her look a bit androgynous. Had she always been this way? Why had he been so captivated by her? He jumped a little when Noelle put a glass of whiskey next to her elbow, but the woman just flipped a bill onto her tray and lifted the glass to her lips. Noelle, however, looked mad enough to spit fire. "You know the rules, Brandy. This is neutral ground. No hunting in my bar." "Relax, Nona. You know I do my hunting elsewhere. Besides, he's seeing a little clearer now. Aren't you, sport?" Russell nodded and told Noelle he wanted another whiskey. She nodded, but she gave him a sad look that was equal parts pity and disappointment before leaving. He suddenly felt like a disobedient teenager whose parents have waited up for him after he stayed out all night. He wanted to call her back and apologize, but he felt silly and squashed the idea before it could take root. What would he begin to apologize for anyway? "You were saying?" Russell prompted as Noelle made her way back to the bar. The woman looked up from her drink and fixed him with a quizzical look. "You sure you want to hear it, kid? It's not a story to be taken lightly." Russell nodded, sure that he wanted to hear it more than anything in the world. She set her glass down and extended a hand across the table to him. "My name is Brandy, but when this story took place, they called me Elizabeth, Beth for short. I was 19, naive, and in love for the first time in my life. I met him in a bar, much like this one, and he changed my life forever. Have another drink, won't you? I think you'd be a lot happier with another drink." She lifted the glass to her lips again, and Russell watched as she breathed a corona of fire into the whiskey. He wanted it less this time, but he still reached for it. He downed it quickly, the whiskey like a bonfire burning in his guts when he swallowed it. Her face swam a little when he looked back up at her, the third glass settling sluggishly as his head swam. "He was young and swarthy when I met him. I believed he was the most handsome man at the bar, and I suppose he was. He had saved me from a handsy drunk about a week before, and I'd been building up my courage to speak with him. He tried to dissuade me, just as I tried to dissuade you, but to no avail. Glamour hits a human hard, and I was certainly no exception." Russell shook his head as Beth took a sip of her drink. As she talked, he started thinking that maybe she had spiked his drink with something. As he watched her drink, her nose, so cute and turned up, now looked pug-like, if not piggish. Her curly brown hair was a little less lustrous, more like old yarn that looked coarse as it sat against her skull. As she closed her eyes in mid-drink, Russell had to do a double take. Were those horns amongst her curls? He could clearly see one, a curly ram's horn that poked through her curls, but the other one hid behind a lock of yarnish hair. She seemed to notice as the glass came down, and grinned a little too brightly. "See something you like?" When Russell didn't respond, she shrugged and continued. "Where was I? Oh yes, my mysterious savior. He tried to talk to me, as I tried to talk to you, but I was so caught up in him that I barely heard him. Finally, he did as I have done. Only then I was able to break through my own desire. He apologized for what he had done, for giving me what he called a curse, and began to tell his own story." She took a sip from her drink and shrugged at Russell. "I won't bore you with the long version. Don't think we have time anyway." The soft buzz of the bar around him sounded like the quiet voices of insects. Russell didn't know how long he'd been talking, but he was surrounded by a different kind of glamour now. The longer he listened to her, the less human she appeared, and the more he feared what she had to say. Her ears were becoming long and bat-like, long black hair curling up from them. Despite this, he couldn't look away. There was still some of that beauty there, like an unfinished wooden idol that begged to be carved. The story demanded to be finished, demanded that he receive it. He told me that he had found himself taken with a young man in Greece when he was around my age. This young man had tried to turn him away, but finally had shown him what lay beneath the glamour and the terrible curse that he must now bear. The man I spoke to was a Brandylou, just as the man who gave him the curse was, just as I am, and just as you will be." Russell sat back a little. "Me? But why am I, who have drunk of my essence? The pact is already forged. Brandylou are creatures outside of time, capable of living for thousands of years, or for a single hour, whatever fate she desires." "She?" Russell asked tentatively. "We, and there are more of us, are servants of the Pale Lady. She brings the green. She defeats he who devours, and she keeps the world in balance. We serve her as we serve all growing things. We serve her by thinning the herd." That sent a chill down Russell's spine. The man who turned him never told him that. He told him all the rest, but never told him of his purpose. as we sat in the hot bar on a summer night at the turn of the 19th century. He told me of his first time. He told me how he realized his true purpose. She leaned in close, and when she smiled at Russell, he could see her teeth were long and fearsome. "Drink this one slowly, while I tell you of the horrors that await you." She handed him the whiskey, but Russell hardly wanted it. I remember barely being able to process what had happened when suddenly he was gone. I panicked and staggered out of the bar in a haze of spirits. I heard Noelle screeching behind me, but I didn't stop until the nightlife had enveloped me. There was an emptiness in my guts, and suddenly I felt the need to be as empty as that feeling. I retched and retched, the passers-by diverting around me. When all that was left was dry and painful heaving, I began to stagger home. He had forgotten one essential part, you see. He forgot to tell me that my first time would be the worst. She drank off half of her glass, a glass Russell hadn't seen her refill, but seemed to be saving the other half for a special occasion. I staggered in, and there she was, waiting for me. My sister was a woman grown, 16 and so mature. When I came through the door, she ran to me to make sure I was okay. At that moment, I could smell her. I could smell her fear, her joy, the aroma of her slowly rotting meat. When she wrapped her arms around me, I felt my mouth press against her shoulder. She wanted to know where I had been and why I had been gone for so long, and she was so glad to see me, and so glad I hadn't been picked up by some bad man. Her sobs of joy suddenly turned to sobs of pain, however. She screamed in terror when I bit her, my teeth becoming knives as I wolfed down her flesh. I could feel the spot inside me filling then. She was filling me as she disappeared. I discovered my purpose then. When the voices came to see what all the ruckus was about, I hadn't left a bone or a shred of flesh to mark her as someone that ever existed. She finished the glass and called for another. Her cheeks had become very red, and when she looked at him, he could see her face had taken on a distinctly goatish cast. She looked only partially human, half human, more beastly all the time as the two of them talked. He heard the sound of hooves beneath him, heavy equine steps on the marble floor, but he dared not look at what other horrors now surrounded him. So I left and kept running until I found myself here again. I held no illusions that I would have 600 years, but I've seen much of the world in my century of life. I've seen much, learned much, eaten well on many occasions, but I have always lived with the knowledge that you would be waiting somewhere for me. Russell went to take a sip and found his own glass that was empty too. When had he drunk it? He had been so entranced by her story, and now, before his eyes, she had become more beast than woman. Her furry face was marked with dark brown hair, and as he stared, she seemed to wobble like a mirage before his stunned eyes. He told me you would be, that one day you would be waiting for me in this bar, and it would be my time to go. His time lasted nearly 900 years, but it seems my own has hardly begun. Russell shook his head, trying to clear it. But why? Why must it be this way? Brandy shrugged. You got me, kid. This is how it's always been. One Brandylou transfers his power to the vessel, who can penetrate their glamour. But I was fooled by your glamour. You had to... You saw me in the first place, despite me not wanting to be seen. The rules are very clear about what must be done. Don't fret too much. I've lived a long life, eaten well when I had to, seen much of the world, and can die with no regrets. In a way, I suppose it's a blessing. I do not envy you what you must do. There's a war coming, Russell. The carefree days will soon pass, and when the cold comes again, the Brandylou will be summoned to her side, and once more called to serve their queen. But as for me, she drank the whiskey off and saved only the smallest puddle at the bottom. My time has come. Good luck, kid. Russell had so many questions, so many things he wanted to ask, but suddenly, the hooves were behind him again, and this time he did turn to see their owner. Behind him stood a strange beast the color of spring mud. Her feet were scrunched into wicked hooves. Her legs seemed to have too many angles to be comfortable to walk on. She wore an apron. The garment looked odd as it hung over her torso like a child's nightshirt, and it held a tray in one hand. Her eyes bore into him, and he was suddenly aware that this was Noelle. She was a creature who had lived hundreds of years ago and still served at this halfway house of oddities. She shook her head slowly, the green eyes full of summer fire, as she surveyed this new thing that had taken Russell's place. She did not seem to approve. "The accords with strange mean that I tolerate you, Brandylou, but they do not mean that I like it. You will find shelter here, but mark my words. These walls are neutral ground, and I will suffer no hunting here. Find your sport elsewhere, or be dust before your time." Russell gulped and shook his head. "Noelle, it's me. It's Russell. You know me." Her gaze never faltered. "Whatever you were is now gone. What you are will follow my rules, or be damned for it." "But she's the Brandylou. I'm only..." "There's no one here but you, loathsome creature. I will suffer no tricks and tolerate no bloodshed. Be about your business and do not linger." And with that, she clopped off as Russell sat gape-mouthed. He turned back to ask what Noelle had meant, but found his companion was nothing but a pile of clothes and a spilled puddle of whiskey. Whatever she had transferred in that final drink had been given, and now, Russell knew, it was he who must go on. It was he who must carry on in her stead. It was he who must be the Brandylou. The mirror showed Dominic reflections that weren't his own. The mirror was an oddity, but an oddity that he would come to rely on. The hell is this thing? Dominic had been browsing for things he could sell at his local thrift store, and the mirror had caught his eye. It stood out because this shop didn't usually put trash out with their junk. The mirror was fractured in 7 places, and it looked like someone had punched it in the center and sent spider cracks through the glass. At first he thought it was some kind of joke mirror, because when he looked at it, he saw 7 different reflections, and only 2 of them were his. The 2 that were him were on the top right and the bottom left. The left one showed a much younger Dominic as he shuddered on a metal frame bed in Clarence County Prison. At first, he thought it was just some inmate. Everyone kind of looked the same with a bald head and stripes on. But he would never forget that cell. It had the swastikas carved on the wall behind it, the legend that stated "cops are bastards" below it, and the picture of his then wife that he had stuck up with toothpaste to add some color to the cell. It was him all right, but the one across from it was much more interesting. The top right showed Dominic picking up a painting in the art section, a painting with a price tag on it that read $2,000 in your pocket. Dominic was no fool. He wanted to make sure this wasn't some kind of weird trick first. He'd grown up in gangs and living rough, and he knew a hustle when he saw one. It was an impressive hustle, to be sure, but it still smelled like a hustle to him. Dominic went to the little section they had for art, and sure enough, there was a weird picture of women sitting on a balcony, their faces seeming to grin and scream all at once. The price tag on the front was not for $2,000, however, and was for a much more reasonable $10. Dominic thought it over, pulling out his phone as he snapped a picture, and looked to see what it was worth. He found a page for some artist named Roland DePriest, and it just so happened that a lot of his paintings were going for big bucks since he'd recently offed himself. A quick look told Dominic that this was indeed a DePriest, and the going price for it was about $2,000 as of this afternoon. He picked up the painting and the mirror, deciding to take both home with him. "What you want that ratty old mirror for?" asked Mr. Drussel, looking at the broken glass without much interest. Clearly, he couldn't see what Dominic saw in it, and that might be for the better. "I like the frame," Dominic lied. "Think I might use it for something." Mr. Drusel looked at the painting in a precursory way, but shrugged as he tapped it all up on his calculator. $10, he said, holding his wrinkly hand out with expectation. Mr. Drusel did business in cash and did not truck with the little plastic card machines. "What about the mirror?" Dominic asked, not wanting to get scammed after the fact. Take it. I can't sell a broken mirror, and the frame looks ugly anyway. If you want it, then by all means, take it off my hands. Just don't cut yourself on the glass. I'd hate for you to try to sue me after I gave you such a great deal on it." Dominic nodded, thanking Mr. Drusel as he left the little shop, with a tinkle of the bell overhead. The painting sold for the proposed $2,000 to a scalper friend of his, and the mirror Dominic hung in his bedroom. For a week, the mirror did little more than show him going about mundane tasks, and Dominic began to wonder if he really had been had. The little inmate still stayed in his cell, sometimes going out for chow, but mostly just staying and looking sad. That tracked, Dominic had spent a lot of his time being sad about one thing or another. Sad that he was stuck in prison for 5 years at first, then sad that his wife had left him towards the end. He tried to figure out what the other spots meant, but they were kind of mysterious. The middle two showed awful things he didn't like to think about. He was a tough guy. He'd been in his fair share of scrapes and seen people get killed in his lifetime. But this stuff was so much worse. People beating kids, people killing their wives, people hurting animals, and everything in between. The one next to it wasn't much better. He could see mothers tucking in starving kids, homeless people crying as they used the last of their money for a bottle of cheap alcohol, even little kids huddled together as they hid from someone. Some of what that mirror showed him was terrible, but some of it was as helpful as the painting had been. The top left panel showed a woman he knew all too well as she went about her daily life. He should know her. She was his ex-wife. The bitch had divorced him while he was in prison and took most of his stuff while he was too incarcerated to do anything about it. She had taken advantage of him while he was at his lowest, and for that, he hated her. In that respect, he thought of that tab as his eternal enemy, and even wrote it on a post-it note and stuck it to the wall. The mirror turned out to be useful when it came to avoiding her, proving itself one day just as he was about to leave. He was going out on a date, his hair freshly cut and his cologne not too heavy, when someone knocked on the door. His date was supposed to meet him at the restaurant, but he thought maybe she'd come to pick him up instead, and came out of the bathroom towards the front of the house. He was walking past the mirror when he suddenly saw his ex standing outside a very familiar door. She did this sort of thing sometimes, especially if she could Facebook stalk enough information to realize he was serious about someone. He hid out, letting her knock for a while longer, but she finally got bored and left. Dominic was only a few minutes late for his date, and used this little peephole often so he could avoid running into his ex. On the other hand, the bottom right panel showed him an older man he had never met before. Watching that guy was like watching lifestyles of the rich and famous. He ate expensive food, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, and went to bed with somebody new every time Dominic noticed. He decided to leave that label blank for now, not really sure what he was seeing or how it would come to affect him. He found that on days when he didn't have anything better to do, he was checking the mirror to see what he could see. Dominic had definitely found some windfalls from the mirror. The 3 scratch-offs he'd won kept his rent paid, but he was looking for another big score like the painting. On the top right, Dominic was back at the thrift store, but it was a different one today. Dominic watched as he picked up an expensive-looking fur coat, putting it on as he preened a little in front of the mirror. Then, he stuck his hand in the pocket and pulled out a diamond watch that, even to an untrained eye like Dominic's, looked expensive. The thrift store was known to him, a little second-hand store on Mulbank, and after checking that his ex was still at her job, he decided to go see if lightning would strike twice. The thrift store wasn't crowded, and the coat was loud enough to be seen from the entrance. Dominic assumed that it would reek of liquor and cheap cigars, looking like some wannabe pimp's prop, but the coat was in immaculate condition. The tag said it was a Vanderfur, a brand even Dominic was familiar with. He put it on and went to the mirror, preening a little as he'd seen himself do. The coat looked good, very good in fact, and it would go well with some of the shoes he had at home. As he stuck his hand into the pocket, however, it was time for the moment of truth. At first there was nothing. Then suddenly, his fingers touched the harsh surface of an expensive watch. Dominic pulled out a Rolex with, honest-to-God, diamonds on the face. The whole thing gleamed obscenely, and Dominic longed to slide it on and feel the weight of it. This was the sort of thing that he had dreamed of as a kid, driving around town in a fancy car with a hot girl in the passenger seat and an expensive timepiece on his arm, in a primo coat. He'd be the envy of anyone he knew, but as he turned to go, he heard someone at the counter asking about the coat. "It was a Vanderfur. I donated it this morning, but my watch must have fallen out in the pocket. Please, I beg you, I need that watch back. It belonged to my father, and it has great sentimental value." Dominic intended to walk right on without acknowledging the man, finders keepers and all that, but as he caught sight of him in profile, he felt his breath whoosh out in a gasp. It was the guy from the broken mirror, the guy who lived so lavishly. Dominic couldn't have said why, but suddenly he was tapping the guy on the shoulder and holding out the expensive watch. "I heard what you were saying, sir. I came to buy this coat and found the watch in the pocket. It's too nice for me anyway," he said, smiling as the joke fell flat. The older man's smile went ear to ear. "Oh my God, thank you, young man. I can't believe how kind you are." "Yeah," Dominic said. "Me either." The man stood mooning over the watch for a few minutes as Dominic paid for his new coat. It was a little more than he strictly wanted to pay for a coat, but he found that he liked it, and it would help him remember a time when he'd been so generous. He started to think that maybe he could sell it for more than he'd paid for it, when someone stopped him on the sidewalk. The guy was running after him, asking him to wait as the watch threatened to slip off his wrist again. "I owe you something, at least, for being so kind," he said, panting a little as he caught his breath. "It's really okay, mister. You don't have to." "I insist," the man said, taking a watch out of his suit coat that looked almost as impressive as the one he was wearing. "My father bought me the watch you found when I was 18 and about to leave for college. This watch doesn't have nearly as much sentimental value, but I think it will help you nonetheless." He put the watch in Dominic's hand and patted it warmly. "I'm in your debt, sir. Hopefully, I can find a way to repay you someday." The watch was nice. Not as nice as the one he had, but still nice. Dominic sold it for about $1,300 and used the money to not only float himself for a while, but also buy a much cheaper timepiece that still looked richer than anything he'd ever owned. He too wanted a reminder of that warm feeling he had felt when he'd done something nice for someone else. With the rent on his dingy apartment paid for the next few months, Dominic was spending a lot of time watching the mirror. He had decided that the panel with the rich man might be his greatest friend, if his ex was to be his greatest enemy. The top and bottom corners were his past and future, and he used the former to enhance his own future often. The middle two were still a mystery to him, but he felt like they might make sense in time. The top panel, the one that took up the most space, however, made him a little more uneasy. It was gray, the sky full of cracks as it swam like a puddle when you throw a rock into it. Dominic felt like he knew that sky, but he couldn't place it. He'd never seen a gray sky like that in his life. Except he had. He knew he had. He just didn't know when. He tried to look at that space as little as possible, but it kept drawing his eye, making him want to take the mirror and throw it somewhere where it couldn't make him feel that way anymore. That was usually how he got stuck looking at the middle two panels. Anything to take his mind off that gray sky full of cracks. The mirror kept showing him things and leading him to opportunities, but it wasn't until he saw one of the faces from the middle panel that he thought he knew its true purpose. He would later reflect on what leap of ego had led him to believe that he knew the purpose of such a thing like this. He was at Marcy's buying groceries one day when he saw a familiar face in line, the true nature of the panel seeming to come to him. He'd seen the woman before, too many mouths to feed and not enough hours in the day to work to feed them. She was standing at the register, her card having been declined, deciding between a gallon of milk and a box of diapers, to diaper the baby or have milk for the other 4. "Here," Dominic said, paying the cashier the remainder from his own wallet. He had no idea why he had been so moved to help, but it made him feel good to do so. The woman thanked him profusely, almost to an embarrassing degree, but Dominic told her not to worry about it. She could pay him back if she felt strongly about it, and here was a little more to get her through the week if she needed it. The woman cried as she tried to refuse him, but the money went into her purse regardless, and Dominic smiled as he watched her go. After that, he began to use his money to help others more often. The mirror helped him invest his windfalls, helped him change his life for the better, and as he grew, so did his altruism. Suddenly he was no longer giving money to single mothers or tipping bills into homeless people's cups, but he was helping the city open shelters, providing programs with startup capital so they could offer meals to people in need, and changing the poverty-stricken neighborhood he lived in for the better. That was how he reconnected with the man from the thrift store, and it was a meeting that would change his life forever. The mirror had shown him that today he would meet someone who would change his life, but he had never expected it to be the man who had begun his charity. As he gave the keynote speech, he could see an ocean of faces that had once looked hopelessly out of the mirror at him. He had given them the hope that they now saw, and the feeling made him tingle. He had always wanted to be someone who could help others, even as he struggled to help himself. He had never realized it. He had something worthwhile to give now, and he was on top of the world. As he ladled punch into a plastic cup, he heard a voice that he hadn't thought of in 4 years. "Looks like you've come a long way since the thrift store. I almost didn't recognize you until you started to speak up there." Dominic turned, and there was the man who had given him the watch. He extended a hand. "We've never been formally introduced. I'm David Rothschild, philanthropist and tech mogul." "Dominic Fraser, it's nice to see you again." And it was nice. The two of them talked for the rest of the afternoon, and when they parted ways at sunset, they were already working out plans for a venture together. Dominic had given him some stock advice, something the mirror had showed him the day before, and the two parted with promises that they'd get together again very soon. Dominic returned to his apartment, the same dingy one-bedroom he'd lived in for years, wanting to see what the future had in store now that he'd found a man like David to partner with. Instead of grand business ventures and philanthropic outreach, however, he was greeted with himself stabbing his new friend to death. Dominic stared at the mirror for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing. This couldn't be his future. Why would he do such a thing? He had a lot of respect for David and couldn't imagine why he would want to hurt him. It had to be a fluke, a trick of the light. But every time he came back to the mirror, it showed him the same thing. His knife, red with David's blood, and David lying on the floor of his tiny apartment. It never changed. It never wavered. And Dominic decided that enough was enough where the mirror was concerned. He put it in the hall closet, shutting it and its proposed future away for good. At least, he hoped so. He spent a lot of time with David in the coming months. The two did a lot of good for the community, for many communities, and Dominic saw himself living a part of that lifestyle that he'd only seen through the mirror. Jet-setting, eating lavish meals, living the sort of life he had always dreamed about, and with a friend like David, he could live that life with an ease that he had never known. Dominic was the happiest he had ever been, or he would have been if not for the dreams. In the dreams, he always saw himself standing over David's corpse as he bled out onto the tacky carpet. In the dream, he could hear the sirens approaching as he stood over the man like a conquering hero. In the dream, Dominic knew that his life as he knew it was about to come to an end. It started very subtly, Dominic began spending days back at home instead of with David. He was busy with other projects. He needed to give attention to some local charities. He needed to reconnect with his roots and remember the people who needed him. These were all excuses he gave his new friend, but in reality, David had begun to resent his business partner. David Rothschild, who had everything except a criminal record and a checkered past. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if David was going to mess him up on purpose. Did he know that Dominic was supposed to kill him? Was this his way of stealing his happiness? Just like that bitch of an ex-wife of his. Were they in this together? Was she so unhappy with his success that she would stoop to making him miserable again? Dominic spent all his time in his apartment, staring at the mirror and willing it to show him anything but the bloody end of his happiness. When the knock on his door came, he realized he hadn't left that apartment in weeks. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before. Or was it the week before? They clung to him sweatily, and the smell from his pants made him think that he might have soiled himself. Now that he was back from his trance, he wondered when was the last time he had eaten. His stomach growled angrily, and he'd gotten up to go to the kitchen when he heard the knock again. "Dominic, are you there? Your secretary said I could find you here. Are you home?" David again. Dominic got up, walking angrily to the door. He could send him away. Better lose a friend than lose his life. He liked David a lot. He was a good friend, but he liked being a free man more. He had wasted 5 years in prison, and he'd be damned if he'd go back. He didn't care what some mirror had to say. He wasn't going to let anyone jeopardize his future. "Go away. I don't want to talk to you." "But why? What did I do?" Dominic closed his eyes, trying not to let the rage that was building behind them out. What had he done? Like he didn't know. He was only trying to steal his freedom from him. "I don't owe you an explanation. Please, just leave. I don't want to hurt you." "I'm not leaving until you tell me why you're acting like this. I'll stand here all night if I have to. I just want to see what's going on with you. I'm worried, Dominic. I'm worried about you." Dominic didn't remember opening the door, but suddenly the two men were face to face. Some of his neighbors were peeking out of their apartments, trying to see what was going on. Dominic just knew they would be something to talk about tomorrow, and he shuddered to think what sort of stories they might weave. A lover's quarrel? Maybe David had stolen Dominic's girlfriend. Maybe they had stolen money from each other. Who was to say? And all of it would likely paint Dominic the worse for it. "I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see you. Can't you just respect my wishes and—" "Something's going on. You're not acting like yourself. Did someone say something to you? Did you hear something? There's a lot of rumors going around about me. It's the same with most rich people in my circles. I just want to know why you're so—" Dominic was sick of hearing it and shut him up the only way he knew how to. David's tooth flew down the hallway when he hit him, and suddenly the two of them were rolling around the floor and throwing punches. It was the kind of ugly fighting you see in desperate people, and as it rolled into the apartment, Dominic realized he couldn't pummel David into submission. Despite being a decade older than him, the man was in better physical shape than he ever had a prayer of being. As David rained down blows on him, Dominic sent his hands searching for something to defend himself with. The knife was something he had lost years ago, a steak knife that had tumbled from his plate and rolled under the couch forever. But when his fingers locked onto it, he knew what to do. Before he knew what was happening, he was standing over David, the other having been stabbed more than a dozen times. The sirens were coming, and as Dominic let the knife slip from his numb fingers, he realized they had taken it from him anyway. His life, for better or worse, was over now. Well, not all of it. There was still a little more left. The trial had been short. They had found him in the apartment with the murder weapon and the victim, his prints all over both of them. There had been witnesses that had seen the two fight, and it seemed to be an open and shut case. The Rothschilds found a slew of witnesses willing to testify that Dominic had been the aggressor, and with his checkered past, all his lawyer could do was get him life. It had been a sham of a trial, and Dominic didn't know why the court had bothered with it. They wanted him to be guilty. The mirror had told him as much, and now his life was over. The guards at Clarence County smiled knowingly when they saw him get off the bus. "Welcome back," that smile seemed to say, "and didn't we tell you you'd be back?" As he lay on the floor of his old cell, the cell they'd seemed to think it was so funny to put him back in, he realized what the gray sky had been showing him all along. As he lay on the filthy floor and looked at the cracks in the ceiling, he finally realized why they had looked so familiar. This was his life now, his life and his death, and he wondered how long he would have to look at those cracks and that pitted, pitiable concrete before someone came along and put him out of his misery. If the mirror knew, it certainly wasn't telling anymore. There once was a man with ears, you see, in the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods to scream, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the Bunnyman come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the Bunnyman come, and your soul shall belong to him. "Stop it, Catherine!" I'd scream, but Catherine just cackled and sang it all the louder. I can still remember my sister's face because of that ghoulish smile she wore while she tormented me. We grew up in New Zealand, so the shanty was something old that we changed for our own purposes. Many of the kids sang it, but my sister was the first to adopt it into something different from the original. A few kids had added some creative lyrics to the original song, usually something about farty men or something, but Catherine had turned it into a song about the Bunnyman. She was forbidden from singing it at school. By our parents and teachers, and she took it as an excuse to sing it for me at every opportunity. It was usually sung low, under her breath, so my parents couldn't hear it, so she could deny it when I began crying about it. It was in poor taste anyway. The Bunnyman may have been an urban legend, but the man going around kidnapping children was very real. That summer, 13 children had gone missing in the city we lived in. All of them were from poor families like ours, who lived in tenement buildings, much like ours. They always disappeared in the middle of the night after being lured out of their houses, and there was always some sign left behind that tied them together. Whether it was spray painted on their door, the fence behind their house, or the sides of the building they lived in, the calling card was always left in plain white spray paint for the police to find. A white rabbit head in a white circle, the sign of the Bunnyman. My sister had started humming the little shanty after the 7th kid had gone missing. I had heard her in her room, working through the lyrics as we did homework. She would hum them to herself in a distracted way that people often do while they're trying to figure something out. As she scratched away at the math problem, she would argue with herself and make corrections to the grisly little shanty she was constructing. I would shudder to myself as I heard what she was writing, and I think I might have become her horrified little barometer. The more I shuddered, the more lyrics I heard that stayed in place. By the time school started again in August, her shanty had taken form, and she began her reign of terror. Catherine and I were 2 years apart. I had started 6th grade, and she had started 8th, and she seemed to delight in terrorizing the other girls in my class with her Bunnyman song. She would walk behind groups of students, humming the tune at first as they walked from class or to lunch. Then she would begin singing the words to herself, low at first, building volume, until a few of them started to hear what she was singing and become noticeably upset. Then she would run up behind the group, caterwauling the last verse as she sent them screaming and running in all directions. That's how she had earned herself a suspension from school and a grounding from our parents. That's why she was home that night, the night of December 15th, the night the Bunnyman did indeed come. We were both grounded that night, actually. My sister was grounded after being suspended from school for her Bunnyman shenanigans, but she didn't much care. She was happy to put off schoolwork and watch TV all day and suffer the wrath of our parents. I, however, was grounded for encouraging these antics by saying I had seen the Bunnyman. It wasn't a joke, though. I wasn't trying to encourage Catherine in her bad behavior. I had woken up for the 6th night in a row, hearing someone humming that shanty and going to the window to see who it was. I couldn't actually be hearing anyone, I realize now. Our loft was on the 5th floor, looking out on a vacant lot and the road behind the building. There was no way I should be able to hear anything. I could, though. I can clearly remember hearing that shanty, hummed in a gravelly baritone that sounded as though it were right outside the window. The first few times I heard it, I went to the window and looked out on the lot. In the moonlight, he was standing there, in the road, a man in a dingy gray rabbit costume, his eyes glowing yellow and his ears cocked almost jauntily. My parents would hear me screaming and come running into the room to see what was going on. They would find me on the floor, screaming and pointing out the window, always gibbering about the Bunnyman. After the 3rd night, I didn't even go to the window. I would lie in bed and sob as the shanty bore its way into my brain. I would sob and call for them, screaming about the damn Bunnyman, until finally, my father couldn't take it anymore. That's why both of us were grounded on the night in question, the night our parents went out. It was supposed to be a family night. We were supposed to go out and have a real family meal, see a movie, maybe get some ice cream. Instead, my father had been using it as a punishment for my sister after she'd gotten in trouble. We 3 would go out and have fun while she stayed home and did not. My mother, however, thought this was a little harsh, and she had been pleading with him to reconsider. This had made him a little short, and after being woken up by my screaming all week, he had reached his limit. He grounded me as well, thinking I was trying to egg my sister on with all this Bunnyman nonsense, and announced that he and my mother were going on a date instead. "We will be back at 10. You 2 are to be in bed by 8:30. If I come in and you're still awake, you will be severely punished." Then they left, and for a few hours we'd gotten along pretty well. Catherine made dinner, heating up some canned pasta in the microwave, and then we'd watch some TV as the sun set and the evening wore on. It wasn't until 8, when I got off the couch and started for bed, that she started in on her old ways. She asked what I was doing, and when I told her I was going to get ready for bed, she asked me why. "You heard, Dad. If we're still up when he gets here, we're going to get in trouble." "Pfft, probably just scared the Bunnyman will hear you awake and come get you." "I am not," I lied. "R2, you're in such a hurry to go to sleep, so the Bunnyman will come and take you away." She leaned towards me, grinning that awful grin. "Oh, there once was a man with ears, you see." I put my hands over my ears and started running away as she sang all the louder and chased me. "In the dead of the night, he'll come for thee." "Catherine, stop it," I sobbed. We were running up the hall, and as I wheeled into my room, I tried to slam the door and lock her out. She battered the door aside and bore down on me, grinning and singing as I cowered beneath the window. I was covering my head with my arms, sobbing uncontrollably as I tried to block her out. She stalked towards me, bellowing the song now and scritching her hands like claws as she walked towards me. "Soon shall the Bunnyman come to bring..." But she stopped suddenly, and as the silence stretched on, I opened my eyes and looked up to find her looking out the window as she loomed over me. She was staring out the window, transfixed by whatever she saw there, and this new game was almost scarier than the shanty. Her face held a look I was unused to seeing. She was startled, unsure of what she was looking at, but it also appeared that there was terror there. Something outside the window was really spooking her, and I scrambled up to peek under her arm so I could see too. It seemed I was peeking into one of my nightmares. Standing in the road, right under a streetlight, was a man in a tattered gray bunny costume. It wasn't like a Halloween costume, some of which looked like pajamas more than costume, but it was a full suit of coarse-looking gray fur. The fur was matted and dark in places, kinky and tangled like a stuffed animal that needs to be brushed. The head was obscured by a black hood, some kind of costume hood that just slid over the head, and the face was a flat black nothing as it stared at our building. No, not at our building, as it stared at us. On top of the hood, someone had stapled a pair of thin, emaciated gray rabbit ears, one of which bent at an almost jaunty angle. He stood on the street and stared up at us, my sister and I frozen in terror, at the sight of the legendary Bunnyman. All at once, I heard a gruff, tuneless humming from the street that sounded startlingly like Catherine's shanty. He had no words to go along with it. He only hummed and stared, and I think we both felt an almost magnetic desire to stare back at him. It was like the scene in a scary movie where the monster's out in the open, and you pray that none of the characters are stupid enough to go confront him. In your heart, though, you know that one of them is. Catherine, it appeared, was that one. I caught her by the arm as she turned from the window. She looked back at me, her face full of confused anger and unsure deliberation. She was clearly at odds with herself, and my sister was not someone who was used to being unsure of her actions. She was a brat, and she was a terror, but I had always kind of believed that everything she did was a calculated course of risk and reward. This was something else, though. This was her acting against her will. After all, she had sung about the Bunnyman coming for others, and now it appeared he had come for her instead. She jerked her hand away and left the room. When I heard the front door open and close, I moved back to the window, waiting for her to appear. The Bunnyman went right on humming, right on watching, as though he was trying to call me as well. I felt the pull. Really, I did, but my fear kept me rooted to the spot. I clutched the windowsill tightly, the paint chipping a little as my fingers gripped it, and I would find splinters under my nails the next day, though I didn't notice them at the time. Then, she appeared in the backyard, walking like a sleepwalker, and going to him as she vaulted the chain-link fence between the yards and the road. He reached for her, and now I could hear both of them humming that hateful song and staring up at me. It filled my head like a hive of bees, and I knelt my head against the glass as I prayed that it would stop. There would be no way I could resist if they both sang, and I could feel the pull as they tried to drag me out the door as well. After about 60 seconds of them humming and staring, she took his hand, and the two of them disappeared up the road. My parents came home 3 hours later to find me curled up on the floor of my bedroom, sobbing and gibbering as I rocked and mumbled about the Bunnyman. They searched the house, thinking that my sister had gone too far. She had finally scared me too much, and now she was going to have to answer for it. As my mother sat with me, trying to console me, my father tore up the house looking for Catherine. He clearly expected her to be hiding somewhere inside, probably running when she heard the front door open. When he couldn't find her inside, he went looking for her at her friends' houses. Their parents told him, often grumpily, that they hadn't seen Catherine, but they would call if they did. He got worried, going to look up and down the street for her, expecting her to be hidden somewhere in fear of retribution. All the while, Mom tried to calm me down and get a straight answer out of me. After about an hour, I started talking about the Bunnyman and how he had come to get us, how Catherine had left with him. She started to get angry, telling me that she was tired of hearing about the damn Bunnyman. However, when I refused to deviate from my story, she started to take me a little more seriously. The police were called, the neighborhood was searched, people were questioned, and the woods were combed for the next week and a half. No sign was ever found of my sister, or the Bunnyman. No sign was ever found of any of the children abducted by the Bunnyman that year. That was 15 years ago now. The Bunnyman took only one more child that year, a 7-year-old, on Christmas Eve, and then was never seen again. They never found the remains of any of the children he kidnapped, and no one was ever arrested in connection with the kidnappings. There was never any bunny suit found or a murder weapon discovered in the woods. Whoever was doing this had just stopped. I'm 27 now. My own daughter is 8. Her dad's not really in the picture, which leaves a lot of time for just us. I was getting ready for bed one night, Emily playing in her room before bedtime, when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The tune, a familiar tune that everyone in town knows, crept up the hallway. The tune wasn't what stopped me, though. It was the lyrics that made me shiver. The words she sang transported me back in time, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, watching my older sister creep towards me as she sang the same hateful words. However, the voice that sang them was childish, lilting the words with no more care than she would have had for any other nursery rhyme. There once was a man with ears, you see. In the dead of the night he'll come for thee. He'll drag you into the woods so green, and there your bones he'll gnaw. Soon shall the Bunnyman come to take you away from your dad and mum. Soon shall the Bunnyman come, and your soul shall belong to him. I peeked around the corner of the doorframe and saw her on the floor playing with blocks, oblivious to what she was singing. Emily, where did you hear that song? She got up and walked to her bed, giggling as she crawled under the covers. From the funny lady. What funny lady? I asked, bending to tuck her in, but finding my hands incapable. She comes and sings at night sometimes, after you go to sleep. I'll wake you up so you can hear her next time. When I go to the window, she's standing on the street. She has ears on top of her hood, Mommy. Isn't that silly? I told her it was very silly, but I didn't feel like laughing in the least bit. Emily's in my bed now, sleeping soundly, as I pin this warning to anyone whose children have heard this song too. I'm afraid it's not an urban legend. It's not a hoax. The Bunnyman is real, and it seems that he's not alone anymore. He's coming for our children again, and I, for one, don't mean to lose my daughter to this creep or his children. As I lay here writing, I can almost hear it on the breeze, as if someone's singing it outside my window. Emily is stirring in her sleep. It appears it may not just have been in my head. I fear it may already be too late. Mark and I grew up together, meeting in nursery school when we were about 2. We played with the same toys, learned the same games, read the same books, and when we started school, we were both delighted to find that we were in the same class. I didn't really notice the chair at the foot of his bed until we were 6. We were playing Super Nintendo in Mark's room, being rambunctious and probably making a lot of noise. Our game of Mario Kart had turned into a little bit of horseplay, and when I bumped into the old wooden chair at the end of his bed, he jumped up like he'd been scalded. He picked it up, dusting the seat like it might be offended as he placed it carefully back where it had been. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to push your chair over." "That's okay. It's just got to sit there. It's kind of important." "Why is that?" I asked as he reached for his controller to go back to playing the game as if nothing had happened. "Oh, that's where my guardian angel sits at night." He said it in that way that made it very clear this was both something he believed in and was as normal to him as the toast he'd had for breakfast. When he noticed I hadn't picked up my controller to begin playing again, he looked back at me in confusion and seemed surprised by my look of stunned interest. "Your what?" "My guardian angel," he said. "What, you don't have one at the end of your bed every night?" I told him I didn't, and he seemed surprised. "Huh, Mom said everybody had them." He tried to go back to the game again, but I found myself much more interested in this guardian angel thing than our game of Mario Kart. As kids, you get used to hearing your playmates spout out about all kinds of odd things. Sometimes they don't really make sense. This, however, had been endorsed by a grown-up. To a kid barely into his 7th year, the word of an adult was still something I put a lot of stock into. If his mom had told him this, then it had to be true. And if a real angel sat at the end of his bed every night, then I wanted to know more about it, or even see it if I could. "Okay," he said, so when I was little, I woke up and found something at the foot of the bed that scared me. I thought it was a monster at first, but when I went and told my mom about it, she said it was my guardian angel. After that, we left a chair so that it could sit, since before it had just been standing at the foot of the bed. "And it comes every night?" "Every night. And now I'm not afraid of him, since I know that he's there to watch over me." The whole thing interested me greatly. Mark's family didn't strike me as particularly religious. I don't even think he went to church. So the idea of Mark having a guardian angel and not me was a little bit weird. If it was a real thing and Mark wasn't just pulling my leg, I wanted to see it too. That was when I started bothering Mark's mother, my mother, and Mark about having me over for a sleepover. We were getting to that age where sleepovers were pretty common, but it seemed like they just never had a good time to do it. There were always weekend plans. My parents were religious, so we always went to church on Sundays. I started trying for Friday night, or Saturday maybe, but there just always seemed to be something to stop us from spending the night at his house. As if in answer, Mark came to stay at my house a couple of times. That was fun, but it ultimately wasn't what I wanted. We couldn't see Mark's guardian angel at my house after all, so I kept asking and asking if I could stay the night, and finally we found a time that made it work. We were in second grade, a whole 2 years after I started asking, when my parents suddenly needed to go out of town and didn't have a way to bring me with them. It was right in the middle of the school year, and they needed to go to a funeral from Thursday morning to Friday night. It wasn't really the sort of thing you could bring a kid to, and I suggested that maybe I could stay with Mark. My parents liked the idea. We had hosted Mark a few times, so his parents could have a date night or visit relatives, and so they called to see if it was something they could do. Mark's parents said they'd be happy to help, and I was filled with excitement as I packed my bag for a couple of days at Mark's house. Wednesday night was a blast. Mark's dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard while we played on the slip and slide. Mark's mom had rented a game from Blockbuster that we took turns playing. We watched some TV in the living room. His parents said we could stay up a little later than usual, and when his mother said it was time for us to get ready for bed, I felt excited all over again. As I lay on my pallet that night, sleeping in the shadow underneath Mark's bed, I was filled with anticipation as I watched the chair. I'd waited for years to see this, and I wasn't going to sleep until I saw it. The chair just sat there, a mute hunk of wood, and as the lights went out and Mark's last-minute chatter turned into soft snoring, I tried my best to stay awake. I wanted to see it, but as I began to yawn more frequently, I wasn't sure I'd make it. I wondered if Mark really had just been pulling my leg, and as the alarm clock on the nightstand went from 10:30 to 11, I thought it'd be a real joke if there never was an angel, and he'd just been having a laugh at me all these years. As my eyes grew heavy, I tried to keep awake until it got there. Inevitably, though, I lost the fight and fell asleep. I came awake suddenly in the unfamiliar darkness of Mark's bedroom. It was very early, and as I sat up with a start, I remember feeling that momentary sense of confusion. Where was I? What was going on? That was when I remembered that I was at a sleepover at Mark's, and why I was at a sleepover at Mark's. I glanced up at the chair, expecting to see something in white robes with wings and a halo, but I was disappointed in that respect. Disappointed, but utterly terrified. What I saw was a shapeless shadow with vaguely human proportions. The dimensions seemed to move when I watched it, though I don't think it had noticed me. It was leaning forward in the chair, staring at Mark like a hungry shark, and it didn't turn to look at me until I started screaming. It shifted its soupy face towards me, and I saw a pair of dancing red eyes amidst the miasma. It went right on looking at me until someone turned the lights on, and as the room came into view, the creature was just gone. Mark's mother was sympathetic, asking what had happened, and I lied and told her I just had a bad dream. She bought it, I think, but I think Mark knew what I had seen. He tried to ask me about it, but I rolled over and faced the wall as I pretended to go back to sleep. Mark tried again as his mom took us to school the next day, but I didn't want to talk about it. I was as terrified of what I had seen as I was disappointed at the outcome of my curiosity. My parents picked me up from school that day, having gotten back a little early, and I think they too sensed that something had happened. I slept more soundly in my own bed than I ever had before, and I never asked to sleep at Mark's house again. I may have never asked to spend the night at his house. But Mark and I remained good friends. I still went over to his house, I still hung out in his bedroom, but I never stayed after dark again. Incidentally, since the sleepover had been such a success, his mother let Mark stay over at our house more often. This seemed to work better for Mark's parents, too, and looking back, I don't think they got along well. They argued a lot, and many of the trips they took together ended abruptly without helping their marriage. When they divorced after Mark graduated high school, I think it was only really a surprise to Mark. They decided to sell the house and split the money, and Mark decided to move out on his own and start his adult life a little earlier than he had expected. So, when he asked if I wanted to be his roommate, it seemed like a no-brainer. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college Mark was attending, and it was pretty cool. We got on about as well as 2 high school kids moving in for the first time together could. There were arguments about chores, loud parties that probably bothered the neighbors, late-night underage drinking sessions where we told each other all sorts of things, and plenty of general day-to-day life stuff. The things we had meshed well together in our new home, except for one thing he had brought from his old house that stirred up some memories I didn't want to think about. I was helping him move his things out of the back of his dad's F-150 when I caught sight of something that I hadn't thought about in years, though it had played quite often in my nightmares. Picking up a stack of boxes revealed a familiar wooden chair that had sat at the end of Mark's bed for as long as I could remember. It was the chair that the angel had sat in and watched him sleep. I asked him why he had brought it with him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. It's where my guardian angel sits. Duh. Why wouldn't I bring it? I had kind of hoped that the angel was just an at his house kind of thing, and the thought that it might be in our apartment at night gave me the creeps. My boss had been asking if I'd be interested in working the night shift for months, and after seeing that chair sat with such care at the end of his bed, I went and told my boss that I was ready to accept. I wanted to live with Mark and help him out, but I just couldn't stand being in that house at night. I could tell that Mark was a little miffed that I wouldn't be at home at night. Night was kind of the only time he wasn't at school or work, but he understood that the bills had to be paid. I don't think he actually understood why I'd taken the night shift. If I was off, I always kept my door locked and slept facing the wall. If the angel ever came into my room, I never knew about it. I certainly never left a chair at the foot of my bed, and I guess if it came to our house, it stayed in Mark's room. Though I guess in the end, it worked in Mark's favor. I was at work one night, playing on my phone and watching cameras, when my phone rang. I saw that it was Mark and figured he was just making sure I was going to be home in the morning before he had to go to school. When I picked up, however, he sounded frantic. Mark was yelling about needing me home right away and how he needed help calling the police. I told him to calm down and just go ahead and call the cops, but he said he couldn't until he cleaned up a little bit. Then he said the most chilling thing I'd heard since we were kids. The angel got him. Got who? I asked, still not sure what was going on. The intruder that broke into our house. I called my boss and told him about the situation, and he agreed to come work for me so that I could get things sorted out. I offered to come back, but he said there was no need. I was probably looking at police reports and other paperwork anyway, but to let him know if I wasn't going to be in tomorrow night so that he could make arrangements. He even said he'd pay me for the night. My boss was a good guy, one of the best bosses I've ever had, and I always appreciated how helpful he was. By the time I got home, Mark was in a tizzy. With good reason, too, since it looked like someone had exploded across his floor. There was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood across the bedspread of Mark's bed, as well as hair, meat, and bones everywhere. The bones were splintered and broken, and everything looked like someone had been fed into a wood chipper. I didn't know what to make of it, but the most striking was the blood splashed across the plain wooden chair that sat placidly amidst the gore. I pulled Mark into the living room and asked him to tell me exactly what had happened. After a few glasses of water and a little scotch, he finally stopped shaking enough to tell me. He said he had heard the guy come in with a key, and he thought it was me. He had rolled over and went back to sleep, already seeing the angel there and feeling safe as he usually did. When he heard rustling in the living room, he thought it was a little odd, but figured I was just settling in for some gaming. When his bedroom door opened, he knew something was amiss. I didn't usually go into his room at night, especially not after what Mark considered bedtime, and the door opening made him turn to confront whoever it was. He had sat up in bed, looking at the person silhouetted in the hall light, and that's when he saw the angel turn its head to look at the intruder. "What the hell?" the guy said, his voice deep and confused. Mark said he had taken a step into the room, fiddling with something in his pocket, but he never got out what he intended to use. Suddenly the angel was standing, and Mark said it just sort of blurred at the guy. He knew how that sounded, but it was like one minute it was standing beside the chair, and the next they had been face to face in the doorway. He had reached out towards him, his hand sinking into the man's chest, and the intruder had made a noise like he was having indigestion. The angel simply pulled him to pieces. He had ripped him right down the middle, long ways, and that had been where most of the blood had come from. He had thrown him against the wall, well, half of him, and the other half he had dragged to the floor and began to eat. Mark said that had been the worst part, watching it eat. It didn't eat like a normal creature. It ate by pressing its formless head against the body. Parts of the body just disappeared. It was like watching something that I couldn't see devour somebody. As it ate, Mark had gotten shakily out of bed and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room. He had watched the thing as he went, unsure whether it would hurt him or not, and when he came to the door, his hands trembled as he reached for the light switch. Just as the lights came on, the creature had looked up in surprise. Its eyes almost looked betrayed, and as he dissipated, Mark was left with the remains of its feast. I don't know what to do. The cops are never going to believe that some weird angel that I've had since I was a kid tore this guy apart. This is a little excessive, even for a home invader, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. It's probably going to incriminate both of us for me to put this in here, but we came up with a story that wouldn't sound quite so crazy. The story was that Mark had been in the bathroom when the guy came in. Mark had locked the door and hunkered down to wait on them while they started taking things. While hiding, Mark heard something going on in the bedroom, and when everything had gone quiet, he came out to find the guy like that. It was a shaky story. The cops were likely to raise an eyebrow at it, but Mark isn't a very big guy, and the idea that he might have hidden instead of trying to confront a home invader isn't too far-fetched. No more far-fetched than the idea that he could rip a guy in half. So we called the cops, and after answering some questions and a trip to the station for some more questions, we were put up in a hotel for the night while they checked out our apartment. It turned out that the guy who had come in to rob us was the landlord's nephew. We've had several apartments that had been broken into without much sign of a break-in, and the cops finally had their answer. The nephew has been using the keys from the main office to go into people's houses, and he usually chooses places where no one was likely to be home. I'd met the nephew on the on-site gym a few times, and he knew I worked nights and likely thought my apartment would be empty, not realizing I had a roommate. They found a lot of evidence at the nephew's apartment, an apartment owned by his uncle too, so the case seemed pretty open and shut. Most of them thought that he'd had an accomplice who was on drugs or something, and the two had just gotten into a brutal exchange over some of the plunder. We actually got a small reward for calling it in, though I think our landlord had mixed feelings about the whole incident. Mark threw the chair out after that. He just didn't feel safe with it at the end of his bed anymore. The angel had been his guardian, and it had protected him, though maybe a little overzealously. It's unclear whether Mark would still be alive if it hadn't been there, but it seemed that, like me, Mark had seen more than he was comfortable with when he'd seen it attack the guy. He put the chair by the dumpster, and somebody must have taken it because it was gone by the next day. I don't know if the angel still comes back to the foot of his bed or not, but if it does, I guess it's standing these days. I heard he was a mute, and the clapping's how he communicates. I heard he's a ghost, and the clapping's how he gets your attention. I heard you're both big old babies who will believe in anything. Daryl and Gary looked up incredulously at me as I grinned back at them from across the lunch table. Oh yeah? Well, he's been linked to the disappearances of like 4 kids now, so sounds like a pretty good reason to be afraid to me, Daryl said, sounding mad. I just shrugged at him, popping a french fry into my mouth and savoring the salt. There's no proof that this clapping man is responsible for a candy bar going missing at Dell's, let alone Mike Frazier getting snatched. The clapping man story was something that had been circulating for a while. 3 young kids had gone missing first, all of them heading home from somewhere or another, and some of the witnesses had reported hearing a clapping sound before they had gone missing. One of them had even reported seeing a man shape in the woods before hearing the clap. They didn't have any details about the guy, but they said it looked like a person's shadow with long arms. Mickey had been the most recent disappearance, and the one that made the cops around Tiger the most nervous. The first 3 had been younger kids, elementary school students who hadn't looked like much, but Mickey had been a 17-year-old farm kid who was built like a linebacker. The story was that he was trying to find one of his dad's missing sheep around dusk and had just never come back. The stories were that he was near Kendall Covered Bridge and that the sheep had been found dead underneath it the next day. There were the usual rumors that Mickey had run off or left with some girl, left with some boy for all they knew, but those of us who had known Mickey kinda doubted it. Mickey was slow. Not like special ed slow, but he was slower than average. He loved his family. He loved working on his parents' farm, and the thought that he would just run off when he couldn't come back with the sheep was laughable. Mickey liked football too, but if his dad had asked, he would have given it up in a heartbeat. The cops knew this too. That's why they were sure that Mickey had been taken by someone, and that someone had to be big. The bell rang then, but we kept our seats as the good little sheep dispersed around us. We'd leave when the monitor finally told us we had to, and not a minute before. Gary still looked a little nervous as the cafeteria cleared out, but Daryl was pretty used to it. Daryl and me had been hellions since we were young, but it was a life that Gary was slowly getting used to. I'm not a bad kid. Not really. I love my mama, I respect my daddy, and I keep my truck well maintained. I'm good to my girl, when I have one. That being said, I have no time for weakness or rules. The only rule I know is that the strong rule, and it's a rule that I learned from my daddy. If I'm strong, and I am strong, I should be able to do what I want. If other kids don't understand that, well, that's their problem. Just like when I push them down and show them who's boss. Daryl, Gary, and me never really considered ourselves a gang or nothing, but we pal around because we all believe that when you're strong, you're right. Miss Gladys looked our way, and I grinned at her and waved. Miss Gladys is cute, but she ain't strong. She teaches home ec, and she drives a Spark. Nothing about that says strong. She's come over before and tried to talk nice to us to get us back on the straight and narrow, but it never does any good. Eventually, she stopped trying, and when she turned to call Mr. Gersh, the shop teacher, we took to our feet and cleaned the table off, heading for class. Gersh was strong, an 8-year combat vet with scars to prove it, and he was not to be messed with. We were halfway to class when the bell rang for the start of 5th period, and I looked at the boys and told them I thought we should maybe take the rest of the day off. I gotta get to math, Gary said. If I don't keep at least a C, they'll kick me off the football team. Same, Daryl said with a sigh. If I don't pass history test today, my mama says I can't run the roads this weekend. Come on, man, just come to class with us. Beer'll still be there after school. I blew a big old raspberry at him and told them that if they wanted to be pansies, then I'll go drink it all up before they got there. They begged me not to go, but I was done for the day. School had never really held any appeal for me, and I'd already figured I'd drop at the end of the year and go on to hauling lumber like my uncle, or go to farming like my dad. I was too dumb for the army and too lazy for college, but at least I'd figured it out a year before anybody else. "Have fun in class, then," I said, waving as I walked to the parking lot to get my truck. The little Ford Ranger that Daddy had given me wasn't much, but it was fine for now. I really wanted one of those big old F-350s like my uncle had, but I'd either have to save up a bunch of money or steal one to have something that nice. The Ranger was fine, and I slunk out of the lot in low gear before turning and flying up the road for home. The dirt roads of Tiger were like a second home to me, and as I put the schoolhouse behind me, I thought again about just leaving on one of them for parts unknown. What was there really here for me? A dead-end job and a naggy wife, squalling kids and a mortgage I couldn't pay, a bottle of beer after work with the boys, a loveless marriage that would hang like a shackle around my neck, maybe a trip to Stragview if I wasn't careful, or a telephone pole in the night if I'd had a few too many beers. I didn't like to think too much about the future then, preferring to live in the moment, and just this particular moment was about to contain a 12-pack of beer. I pulled up behind the barn so Daddy wouldn't see me if he came home early. Daddy was at the farmer's market till around 4 selling his wares, and I figured he wouldn't be the wiser of me cutting school. I walked off into the field of peanuts, this year's crop, and on into the woods beyond. I'd been exploring the woods since I was potty trained, and the spot I knew of was about a mile back in the old tangle of trees. Daryl and me had found it when we were still small enough to squeeze between the roots of the snaky trees and make a clubhouse down there, and it now served as a spot for us to drink and smoke and bring girls to for some privacy. The forest was familiar, an old friend that had protected me sometimes when Daddy had a little too much to drink, and before I knew it, I could see the old growth of trees in the distance. Most of the forest was thick old oaks and scaggy little pulp trees, but the grove was different. It was old, felt ancient somehow, and being there made me feel peaceful, like nothing could hurt me while I was there. I got to the snaky trees and took a seat on the comfy old roots that stuck above ground, reaching into the gnarled old root system and pulling out a 12-pack of Budweiser. I cracked the first can and drank it quickly, smacking my lips as the crisp taste filled my stomach. This was the good life right here, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. I'd have to trade this kind of carefree time for adulthood soon enough, and the thought of saying goodbye to the snaky tree grove was a little sad. I opened a second one, drinking it slower this time, and as the wind rustled the leaves around me, I felt a yawn creeping up my throat. Daddy and me had been splitting wood before school today, and the early morning and the lukewarm beer was starting to make me groggy. As the second one disappeared and the third one popped open, I got comfy and watched the dragonflies and the little forest animals frolic in the boughs of the trees. I felt at ease, like I was floating, and when the beer can slipped out of my hand and fell into the nest of roots, I was snoring before it dumped its delicious contents on the ground. When I woke up, it was dark, and the sounds of birds and squirrels had been replaced with insects and the scamper of bats. This didn't immediately put me off. I'd been in the woods at night before. Daryl and me had camped out tons of times, and I'd even slept rough a time or two if Mama and Daddy were fighting. I pulled myself out of the tangle of roots and wobbled a little before getting my bearings. I wasn't drunk, not by a long shot, or hung over. I had taken a long nap in the woods, and now it was time to go home and face the music. The school would have called by now and told them I left early, and Daddy would be looking for me during evening chores and not finding me. These things would have culminated into him having a drink as he waited for me, so I was likely in for a bad time. I walked out of the grove, watching my step as I went, and that's when I first heard it. A loud pop sound that made me freeze in place and listen like a spooked deer. I stopped for a count of 5, waiting for it to come again so I could identify it, but all I heard was the quiet sound of the evening woods. I started walking again, but after 5 more steps, I heard the loud pop again. I thought it might be a tree branch cracking at first, but now it sounded more like something familiar. It wasn't a natural sound, not like a branch breaking or a rock bumping as it fell. This was a sound I hadn't really heard out here before. A sound I was familiar with, but seemed alien out here. Sounded like someone bringing their hands together for a single hard clap. Kept walking towards the house, thinking I was hearing things, but the longer I went, the more I heard the clapping sound. It was infrequent, always that one loud pop, and when I looked, there was nothing I could find that would have made it. The longer I walked, the more freaked out I got at the popping. I found myself looking for man shapes in the woods, thinking about what the kids had told the cops. It was big, like someone's shadow standing in the woods. Its arms were longer than usual, and they'd heard a loud clapping sound before their friend had disappeared. I stopped again. It had been closer this time. Sounded like it was about 20 feet away, and the clap had silenced many of the forest creatures that had been buzzing placidly. I wanted to run, but I made myself walk so I didn't trip in a hole or knock myself unconscious with a low-hanging branch. There was also the fact that these were my woods. Nothing bad could happen to me in my woods. No one could hurt me out here. No one would dare to... Now it was closer. 10 feet or better. It was following me, and I was still half a mile from home. I wondered how far it would let me get before it snatched me. Would they find any evidence that I'd been alive? Would they ever find anything? I quickened my pace. Holes be damned. I needed to go. I needed to get out of here. I needed to be behind my door with the lock thrown and the bolt pushed in. I'd hug my daddy and tell him I was sorry and take whatever punishment came, but I needed to know that the monster or freak or whatever was outside couldn't get me. I ducked a branch that I saw as a vague outline and kept moving. The popping had stopped for now, but I knew I wasn't safe. I had to get home. I had to get home. I had to get... I turned my head in the direction of the sound, and there he was. He was man-shaped, that was for sure. He looked like a bulky fella, his arms and legs just thick outlines in the murk. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel him on me. He didn't make a sound, but the longer I stayed still, the more I could hear a low murmur, like a TV show trying to break through the static. I thought he might be frozen by my stare, but as I watched, he raised his hands slowly and brought them together with a single loud clap. I took off like a shot. I ran and ran and ran as the popping followed me. I expected that every step would be my last. A claw would come out, or a set of teeth would clamp down on me, and I'd be dragged away to whatever served as a den for the digestion, or God knew what else. The popping sound started coming from directly behind me, and I could feel the air of those massive hands. I could see lights coming into view up ahead, and I thought I might have gotten turned around and found the highway. I didn't care. I just wanted someone to help me escape this creature, and I wasn't choosy about who. I broke through the tree line to discover that I had come out at the edge of my parents' farm, and the lights were flashlights as people looked for me. They were calling my name as they got closer to the woods, and I tore off towards the field in an attempt to stop them from entering. One of them could have just as easily been the thing's next meal, and I wasn't about to draw them to it. I found Daddy first, his beam turning to fix me, and he wrapped me in a hug as he recognized me. "God damn, boy, I was so scared you'd been took." He hugged me close, the first time I'd ever seen my daddy show that kind of emotion, and when he called out to them that he'd found me, I saw them all start heading to his location. The police came and talked to me, and I don't know if they took me seriously or not. They told people to stay out of the woods for a while and listen for a clapping if they were alone. Mickey was the last kid to go missing in Tiger that year, and when the clapping came back after that, they seemed better prepared for it. That experience changed me, and I'm glad to say that it was for the better. I started taking my schooling a little more seriously, stopped being so impetuous, started helping people instead of taking, and changed my way of thinking a lot. I still believe that strong people are important, but now I also believe that they have a responsibility to help those who aren't strong. I started volunteering to go out and woodland rescue, searching for people who'd gotten lost or looking for remains, and I got approached by the Park Service to see if I wanted to work with them. Now I help educate people so they don't get lost, and I find people who have gone missing. In a way, I guess I owe the Clapping Man a debt. He saved me that night from becoming a monster too, though I doubt it was his intention.